Mm. 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 Hello, hello. Happy Saturday night, everybody. I see I am greeted with some comments of interest. Hi, Dolores. Hi, Dale. Hi, Sandy. And Dale says, I'm feeling somewhat exhausted from watching today's protests. A crazy day. But just imagine what it feels like to be out there protesting all day, as many people were. Stacy says, hello, peoples. Steve says hi. Says hi, Stacy. Sandy, Steve. The S Brigade. We actually have two more Steves. One STEEV, Steve Gonzo, and the other L. Stephen Day. Lana says greetings from Minneapolis. I still hear sirens and the National Guard setting up at Police Precinct Number 2, about 3 miles from me on the northeast side. Lana says they are all week, not just today. And Lana says, please all share this video to your page. Yes, please do share the video. as much as you can, as broadly as you can. And let me remind you of my YouTube channel and my Patreon link at patreon.com/Joe_Firestone. Oh, Steve says Fiorella and Johnny Tsunami have been arrested. How many people were arrested? And I take it they were got arrested, in L.A., correct? Yeah, I hope they're all right. I trust they're all right. Now, what happened to Pasta, by the way? Where's he? So, let's get to the business of the night. I'm going to start off with who they've been bailing out and who's been doing the bailing. And this is by Dave Dayen on May 27th, not his regular column, but it's an article in the American Prospect. And it's entitled, How the Fed Bailed Out the Investor Class Without Spending a Cent. And this article was done in partnership with The Intercept. It appeared in both places, at the American Prospect and at The Intercept, as well. And it starts off with some key takeaways. I will share this for you. And Dave gives the key takeaways. The Federal Reserve announced on March 23rd that it would start direct purchases of corporate debt, an unprecedented rescue of corporate America. Since then, the stock market has risen over 30%. So in other words, they bailed out the stock market, right? Corporate bond funds have recovered, and companies have saved tens of billions in borrowing costs. Thanks to this massive government subsidy, large companies like Boeing and Carnival Cruises were able to avoid taking money directly directly from the federal government, and to sidestep the requirements to keep employees on the payroll by instead issuing bonds and getting those bonds actually bought on the market, on the so-called free market. The Intercept and the American Prospect have identified 49 companies that issued corporate debt since March 23rd, adding up to hundreds of billions they otherwise couldn't have secured so cheaply, providing a safety net to the investor class and making a mockery of the alleged virtues of free market capitalism. What free market capitalism? But government welfare capitalism, otherwise known as lemon socialism. This sets the stage for companies with functionally no revenue path in the near future to take on mounds of additional debt, and could set the stage for a series of defaults. I trust my sound is okay. Before I go further, I'm assuming it's okay because it always seems to be okay Steve says, no doubt, I'm glad Joe's on. I needed a break. Thank you, Steve. Okay, so going back to the article. On March 23rd, 2020 was a critical day in U.S. history, though at the time it felt like another 24 hours on the road to pandemic apocalypse. Over 47,000 Americans had contracted the coronavirus by official count. Hundreds of thousands more were walking around with it undiagnosed. Deaths were just starting to spike. Historic job losses had commenced as lockdowns cascaded across America with no end in sight. The stock market closed more than 35% off its peak, continuing an epic slide that had started a month earlier. So a slide had started on February 23rd. On March 23rd, the stock market closed 35% lower than it had been at its peak. But two actions on March 23rd would swing investors from despair to relief and reveal who really matters in America. That morning, the Federal Reserve announced the deployment of additional tools to support household businesses and the U.S. economy overall in this challenging time. The measures including many actions taken during the 2008 financial crisis, with one new wrinkle: direct purchases of corporate debt. The first non-government bond buying in the Fed's history would now be allowed. Companies have swelled their borrowing in recent years, and experts have identified this as a source of serious economic risk. A sudden shock like the pandemic that wiped out the revenues of corporations would not only cause bankruptcies, but also accelerate bond defaults, broadening stress throughout the financial system. Backstopping the markets for corporate bonds would support investors and capital owners. By the evening of March 23rd, investor confidence was lifted even further. Reports announced progress on a record $2.2 trillion congressional rescue package, a large chunk of which would go to support the Fed's interventions in corporate bond and other markets. And that was the CARES Act, of course. It became law on March 27th, and the investor class, says Dave, has never looked back. While Americans struggle to file unemployment claims and extract stimulus checks from their banks, while small businesses face extinction amid a meager and underbaked federal grant program, the Fed has at least temporarily propped up every equity and credit market in America, and in a testament to its strength, it did so without spending a single cent. The mere announcement of future spending heartened investors who have relied on Fed support since the last financial crisis. This explains the shocking dissonance between collapsing economic conditions and the relative comfort on Wall Street. Between March 23rd and April 30th, the Dow Jones Industrial Average rocketed nearly 6,000 points, a jump of nearly 31%, creating only $7 trillion in capital wealth. The April gains were the biggest in 1 month since 1987. And all it took was an announcement from the Fed. As Dave says, though, the very same month, 20.5 million Americans lost their jobs. Similarly, the Fed's promises to purchase corporate bonds and municipal bonds and asset-based securities and really anything else uplifted credit markets and made corporate borrowing cheaper, a tangible subsidy for large companies. It did not cost the Fed a thing, of course. March ended up setting a record for issuance of investment-grade corporate debt, the safest kind of corporate debt. $268 billion traded hands that month, according to a Moody's Analytics study. I'm sorry, $268 billion traded hands that month, according to Moody's, and April surpassed it at $296 billion. So roughly $550 billion traded hands. Overall, $1 trillion in investment-grade bonds have been issued this year, nearly as much as all of 2019, along with tens of billions more in junk bonds from risky companies, which the Fed has also signaled that it would purchase. Dozens of companies, from troubled aircraft maker Boeing to airline Delta, from ExxonMobil to T-Mobile, have been tapping credit markets they might never have been able to access at lower rates than previously offered. The American Prospect and The Intercept have identified at least 49 large companies that have issued corporate bonds since the Federal Reserve announced it would purchase them. For some, the benefit of cheaper borrowing was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. It is meaningfully changing the way investors are evaluating the risks for a swath of companies, said Catherine Judge, a law professor at Columbia University and expert in financial markets and regulations. The Fed's support disproportionately flows to large corporations with access to credit markets, Judge pointed out. Small and mid-sized businesses with much more need are more likely to struggle. Unlike in 2008, the large corporate entities in line for a bailout didn't create the crisis in the first place. The Fed's actions to save corporations from instant bankruptcy simply by nodding in their direction beats the alternative. The problem is that this same level of a thunderous rescue hasn't been extended beyond the biggest firms, which could lead to an economic landscape where they dominate society in the very near future. I, of course, thought they had already dominated society, but could lead to them dominating even more, right? We have a system for central bankers to throw a life preserver to any large corporation, while everyone else must swim several miles to shore themselves. Congress made the choice to empower the Fed rather than figure out how to adequately support the rest of the economy and its citizens. And it gave the central bank wide discretion over the process, absolving members of Congress from blame, but introducing the Fed's bias towards large corporations and banks into who gets saved and who doesn't. In short, while activists had nitpicked about which companies got small business grants worth $10 million, the real bailout, with trillions on the line rather than millions, was happening quietly at the Fed. Investors are supposed to be risk takers who earn outsized returns because they put their money on the line. The Fed's extraordinary support completely flips that, giving a safety net to those who don't need it and making a mockery of the alleged virtues of free market and capitalism. If nothing, the wealthy ventures can be lost. The only people who bear risks in our society are those who don't have any money to begin with. That's a recipe for soaring sales in pitchforks. But what the Fed is doing may not even be sufficient to protect capital. The week of May 11th saw the biggest percentage drop in the stock market in nearly 2 months, as the Fed actually starts to outlay money. Even it recognizes that not every crisis can necessarily be solved by lending gobs of money to GE. Not only is it socially unsustainable to protect just the rich from the crisis of this magnitude, it may not even work. The CARES Act appropriated $454 billion to the Treasury Department's Exchange Stabilization Fund to be used as an equity stake in a series of Fed credit facilities. You can think of this as similar to a big bank. The ESF, the Exchange Stabilization Fund stake, actually represents the deposit base, which can absorb any losses from Fed lending. In reality, the Fed is perfectly able to take losses through various accounting gimmicks, but it has chosen to limit itself in this fashion. The Fed can then lever those deposits up to 10 to 1, the same way a bank loans well above its deposits. It can probably do more than 10 to 1, but it calculated, it thinks that there won't be more than 10% of what it lends out actually lost. So it's sure it can absorb, the losses if it allows itself a buffer, of 10%. Anyway, Dave goes on, that created a 4.5 trillion with a T, money cannon to back up the promises of the Fed. It was probably Steve Mnuchin's brainchild. As soon as it became clear that a 4.5 trillion slush fund would be created, the equity markets ballooned. The total value of the stock market cratered to 103% of GDP, about 21.8 trillion on March 23rd. By April 30th, it was back to 136.3% of GDP, or 28.9 trillion. By that metric, 7.1 trillion in stock market wealth has been created in the period. That period. Stock market wealth is actual paper wealth. It could be gone tomorrow. We don't know. After all, it used to be 136.3% of GDP, and then it cratered to 103% of GDP. So basically what happened is that it recovered very quickly in 1 month. But if certain things happen, it could go again next month. It's not like there were any other positive stories in the economy in late March and April, so we can attribute most of this uplift to the establishment of Fed loan facilities. Quote, the Fed is the action. It's the only real action, said Marcus Stanley, a policy director with the Coalition Americans for Financial Reform. Almost all of that benefit goes to the wealthy. 2017 report showed that about 10% of Americans own 84% of the stock. More critical was the rescue of the credit markets. By March 23rd, investors had spent a few weeks engaged in fire sales of corporate debt. Cash was fleeing to the safety of Treasury bonds. Reluctance to take on corporate debt triggered higher borrowing costs everywhere. And while bond buying was still going on, many companies found themselves stuck. There was like 10 or 15 days there was no bond issue, said V. Prem Watsa, CEO of Fairfax Financial Holdings, in a May 1st earnings call. Quote, but no one could do a bond issue. The AAA company couldn't do a bond issue. And this graphic shows the fall and rise of AAA-rated corporate bond shares from March until things recovered about a month later, and then things went flat again. But they've been rising slowly again just lately. The Fed's announcement changed the picture. It's signaling we will not let the bond market go low. Stanley said. Quote again, we'll put a floor under the bond market in an aggressive and historically unprecedented way. Anyway, the article goes on with more related to junk bonds. And there's a graphic of junk bonds absolutely hitting the pits on March 21st, and then being up there at a fairly high point by March by 14th, then going flat, and now increasing somewhat again to where it was, okay, on April, it looks like it's about April 11th there, that it hit, okay, a recent peak. It's recovered probably 2/3 of the value it had before the crash started, which was about March 4th. March 4th. On March 23rd, the BlackRock iShares ETF of investment-grade corporate bonds went up to 7.39%. What are ETFs again? I missed that abbreviation. I think it stands for Exchange Trade Funds. Well, there's an exchange stabilization fund, but I think ETFs are exchange trade funds, if I'm not mistaken. There are dozens of ETFs linked to corporate debt, and their charts around this period all resemble a panoramic view of the Grand Canyon, hitting a low point on March 23rd before shooting back up. And there's that graphic. On March 23rd, the BlackRock iShares ETF of investment-grade corporate bonds went up 7.39%. The iShares AAA-rated corporate bond ETF were up 7.52%. Vanguard's intermediate-term corporate bond ETF up 5.43%. And PIMCO's investment-grade corporate bond ETF up 7.06%. Even high-yield corporate bonds ETFs, which hold debt in riskier companies imperiled by the crisis, have the same shape. The effect is often delayed till April 9th, when the Fed announced it would actually buy high-yield ETFs in an indirect bid to reach so-called junk bonds that highly leveraged and risky corporations issue to investors. And the iShares iBox high yield ETF saw its biggest move upward that day since 2008. Other high yield ETFs like Deutsche Trackers and the S&P High Yield Bond Index show a similar spike. Junk bond issuance similarly spiked. The Fed announcements included intentions to buy to buy the municipal bonds, as well as securities backed by student loans, auto loans, credit card debt, and commercial real estate loans to make direct loans to large and mid-sized businesses, and to guarantee the entire $1 trillion money market fund industry. It sent the message that essentially every credit market in existence would get some form of assistance. They consider themselves a lender of last resort, but Peter Bookvar of the Bleakley Advisory Group told CNBC, they're now the lender of all resorts, quote unquote. But the corporate bond rescue is particularly useful to companies sinking under the weight of the economic crash. Carnival Cruise Lines is nobody's idea for sustainable business at the moment. Reeling from a COVID-19 outbreak on its Diamond Princess ship and shut down thereafter in mid-March, Carnival was flirting with a consortium of hedge funds on a high-interest loan above 15%. These vulture funds, including the Apollo Global Management Fund, and Elliott Management, specialized in distressed debt, squeezing governments and businesses with no alternatives. If Carnival couldn't repay the loan, the hedge funds would be primed to take over ownership. But the March 23rd announcement signaling a Fed backstop to all comers suddenly gave Carnival some new options. Within days, it had secured $5.75 billion in loans, including a $4 billion bond issuance at 11.5% interest, and a $1.75 billion bond at an even smaller 5.75% rate that could be converted into Carnival stock. Because we know the alternative was a loan with 15% interest, we can calculate the value to Carnival. The difference in interest on the $4 billion loan is at least $140 million, and on the overall package, closer to $310 million. Carnival also sold equity stakes of $500 million after March 23rd, including 8% of the company to Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund, less than the $1.25 billion the vulture funds were seeking. That's an implicit subsidy of $750 million. Keeping more of the company in shareholders' hands gives them a subsidy as well. In addition, the market capitalization of Carnival grew by $3.5 billion from March 23rd to the end of April. So one company with essentially no social or economic function currently benefited from billions in Fed-induced support. One other good example is Boeing, the basket case aircraft maker with the sketchy record of keeping planes in the sky. The firm rejected a federal bailout after issuing $25 billion in bonds. But that bond issuance was entirely made possible by the Fed's implicit guarantee of the bond markets, the corporate bond markets. Boeing's chief financial officer, Greg Smith, admitted on March 24th, a day after the Fed announcement, that credit markets were essentially closed. 1 month later, it made the sixth largest bond issuance in U.S. history that left investors clamoring for more. Over 600 investors are willing to take up to $70 billion in Boeing debt at the auction. So Boeing didn't avoid a bailout. It got one through the side door from the Fed, and the company knows it. Smith thanked the Trump administration after securing the loan, quote, for the actions they have taken to support our economy and the credit markets, unquote. The bond rescue of Boeing had a secondary benefit. The CARES Act set aside $17 billion in a Treasury-led bailout for firms, quote, critical to national security, unquote, which everyone recognized as code for Boeing. That money would have come with significant strings attached, like equity stakes for the government. By the Fed reopening credit markets to Boeing, the company sidestepped that condition and kept its investors whole. Without the Fed action, Boeing would be significantly owned by the U.S. taxpayers, said Dennis Kelleher of the Wall Street watchdog at Better Markets. That's an implicit subsidy to Boeing and its shareholders. Are you guys angry yet? I'm really, really angry. The lack of conditions had a human cost. Aviation related grants that the Treasury supplied came with the requirement to keep workers on the payroll for 6 months. Are you mad yet? Freed from any restrictions, Boeing almost immediately announced it would cut 16,000 jobs. Similarly, GE, another company that spurned a bailout and floated $6 billion in bonds, cut 13,000 jobs in its aviation unit shortly thereafter. Within weeks of the March 23rd announcement, many large companies had wandered over to the corporate bond trough and taken a sip. Issuance of corporate bonds in April alone jumped to 3 times as much as the year before. The 3 largest weeks in the history of corporate debt offerings were 2 weeks in April and the first week, of May. And there's a listing of the various companies and how much they borrowed. So notice PayPal borrowed $4 billion. That is, they sold $4 billion in corporate bonds on the market because of the Fed's actions by saying it was going to bail them all out. So that provided a backstop and allowed them to borrow from the private markets. I just happened to single out the PayPal company because so many of us happen to use that company for one thing and another, and it doesn't appear to have any financial problems. So there it is. $1 billion for Netflix also. MGM got 500 million. Burlington Coat Factory 300 million. Oh, this is not. There was some that went to Kroger and CVS, but the amounts for them were unclear. Airbnb got $1 million. Dollar General got 1.5 billion. I think one of their stores was destroyed, in Minneapolis. But during the demonstrations over the last 2-3 days. ExxonMobil took 9.5 billion. Nike was good for 6 billion, with 5 billion for Procter and Gamble, 6.5 million for McDonald's. Apple grabbed 8.5 billion. It was 11 billion for Disney. Well, you get the picture. Silicon Valley stalwart Oracle trumped them all with a $20 billion debt offering. And Fairfax Financial Holdings was complaining nobody could get a bond secured $650 billion at the end of April. In March, they were claiming they weren't able to get a loan. There it was. The bond market opened up, Watson said to analysts on the earnings call. The Federal Reserve has been fantastic. The CARES Act has been huge. So that's the story. I'm not going to go through the rest of it. I probably spent already a little too much time on it. Okay, but you're getting the picture. In all, the American Prospect and the Intercept found published reports of bond sales for 49 companies for a total of at least $190.3 billion in bond sales were made just because the Fed said it was willing to provide the backing, and everybody knew there was a $4.5 trillion slush fund there. The interest savings on those bond issuances due to Fed intervention is hard to calculate, but using credit flow research post-announcement, bond issuance estimate of $575 billion and the changes in spreads after March 23rd, it's clearly tens of billions of dollars. And given that one part of the credit hierarchy gives the rest a boost, the market uplift to investors in the $10 trillion corporate debt market would be calculated in hundreds of billions. Combined with ETF and stock market uplift, the trillions in relief absolutely dwarfs what regular Americans got to tide them over during the crisis. This unprecedented rescue of corporate America, done without the outlay of a single U.S. dollar, was described by Fed Chair Jerome Powell in an April 29th news conference as not only necessary but positive. But many companies that would have had to come to the Fed have now been able to finance themselves privately, and that's a good thing, unquote, Powell explained. It is somewhat positive that distressed companies could turn to regular credit markets instead of bottom feeders like the private equity vultures or Warren Buffett. And because of the existing connections to flood the financial system with money, bailouts are almost literally as simple as turning on a light switch or picking up the phone, right? But to properly assess the virtues of the rescue, you have to set it in context. The unemployment rate is 14.7% and rising. Car lines for food banks stretch for miles. As Americans continue to struggle and lose ground, the nation's investment elite have been thus far saved from any downside of the coronavirus crisis. The beneficiaries are largely confined to stockholders, bondholders, and corporate execs, who are often major stockholders. Workers are not only not protected, they're paying for the rescue, with taxpayer money propping up the Fed actions. Well, of course, we don't actually believe in taxpayer money, but you get the picture. It is U.S. government money. Quote, "This is a massive wealth transfer to owners of financial assets," said a former Treasury official who now teaches at Columbia. Quote again, "The rules of the game are supposed to be that equities take the loss, high yield debt holders take the loss," unquote. Allowing them to instead bear no burden is a form of socialism for capitalists. Yes, lemon socialism for capitalists. It would perhaps be most tolerable if anyone other than the rich shared in the gains of this corporate rescue. But the Fed's bond buying program, unlike the Paycheck Protection Program, has no requirements on companies to retain their workers. The Fed changed the term sheets between March 23rd and April 9th. They eliminated such requirements. Apple's recent debt issuance, which could later be purchased directly or indirectly by the Fed, explicitly states that it will be used for, among other things, quote, share buybacks and dividends, forms of leaking money to investors rather than keeping workers on the payroll. So in previous live streams, we discussed the question of whether the Fed can create any net on the financial assets before the private sector. It's not supposed to have the power to do that. Obviously, it has the power to indirectly create enormous net financial assets for private sector companies. In addition, the Fed has essentially outsourced its bond buying and loan making authority to big money managers and banks, heightening the need for connections with these giants to get relief. Smaller companies who don't have the revenue or technical know-how to issue bonds into public markets will find it more difficult to get in line for relief. Meanwhile, lending to small businesses and individuals has slowed as banks pull back during the crisis. By one count, interest rates charged to small businesses are now double the rates for large firms. Running bailouts through the Fed necessarily enhances the survival of large financial players and big corporations. Everyone else must fight for crumbs. Treasury Secretary Mnuchin responded to this charge of special benefits for large corporations at the Senate Banking Committee hearing on May 19th, essentially calling the stealth bailout a good thing. Quote, "The announcement of the corporate bond facility without putting up $1 of taxpayer money unlocked the entire primary and secondary market for corporate bonds, unquote," Treasury Secretary said. Quote again, "Companies that I had expected would need to borrow from us were able to borrow $25 billion in the primary markets." That, unquote. That, by the way, was a reference to Boeing. Congress didn't have to cede authority to the Fed and carp about it after the fact. It could have decided the parameters of any rescue, economic rescue, but that would involve making actual governing decisions, which Congress would rather defer to others. You can argue that in the absence of state functionality, the Fed had to step in. But we're living with the unequal consequences of a central bank that can only solve problems for one set of powerful interests. And perversely, actually rescuing investors, the rich people like members of Congress and the donors they listen to, makes it easier for Congress to keep ignoring the needs of everyone else. Even the Fed understands this at some level. On May 13th, Powell pleaded with Congress to pass stronger fiscal aid to prevent a multi-year economic malaise. Quote, deeper and longer recessions can leave behind lasting damage to the productive capacity of the economy, unquote, he said. On May 12th, the Fed finally kicked off its corporate bond buying program. 50 days after the fateful March 23rd announcement, it was confined to purchasing corporate bond ETFs of once investment-grade fallen angel companies that had gone to junk. Within 2 days, $305 million had been purchased, but while the purchases sent corporate bonds up in value, by and large, the promise of bond buying had already produced the desired effect. The Fed completed the bailout before ever administering it. Anyway, one observer of the Fed thinks that the frame of reference for the market now is that if something goes wrong and the Fed comes in, that's a market opportunity. Okay, and the observer believes the Fed won't be able to sustain such evaluations amid a run of massive bankruptcies and high unemployment. With the hope of a V-shaped economy now completely dead, at some point the markets will have to take notice, and the sugar high from the Fed aiming the money cannon will wear off. Stocks fell modestly in May. Goldman Sachs analysts have predicted a 20% drop in the next 3 months. They're normally quite conservative about these things. If they're predicting a 20% drop in the next 3 months, it could easily be a 40% drop. Noted hedge fund manager David Tepper called the stock market in the first half of May the second most overvalued market in his career, rivaled only by the dot-com boom. And in raw numbers, the valuation increase has gone well beyond the amounts the Fed has promised. Dave says that's what you get when you send the Fed in to handle a problem in the real economy. The Fed is ill-suited as a crisis manager. It sees its job as mainly to boost liquidity and keep assets strong. And also Nathan Tankis says, quote, you can get loans, but the loans don't replace income, unquote. And the observer I quoted before likened the moment to August of 2007, when the Fed actually provided a sufficient amount of money to invert the crisis for a while. But eventually there was a reckoning when asset prices declined and losses hit the system. And he said, quote, this is more like August 2007 than September 2009. And quote again, the idea that we won't have massive insolvency of big companies is crazy, and the Fed will not be there, unquote. The Fed induced a rush into corporate bonds, in other words, pools risk, in an unstable asset, creating the type of financial crisis it seeks to stamp out. Companies with functionally no revenue path in the near future taking on mounds of additional debt could set the stage for a series of defaults, which rose in April. Zombie companies being kept alive by debt markets are going to eventually run up against the fundamentals of operating amid an economic depression. And indebted companies stave off the bankruptcy by firing workers, as Hertz did last month in order to avoid bankruptcy. And help Hertz, the number one auto rental company, historically, filed for Chapter 11 on May 22nd. I did not know that. The very knowledge the Fed will save investors from trouble is likely to accelerate risk throughout the market. If you told a family that you can get a credit card at 18%, but in a downturn, it'll give you an opportunity to get a 3% card, that would incentivize them to spend a lot of money, said Bharat Ramamurthy, one of the members of the Congressional Oversight Commission. The Fed itself has called out this possibility. Powell's comments on May 13th were accompanied by a May 15th financial stability report. Just how deeply does the Fed have its fingers in the dough of the economy? Recent job growth numbers reflect what you'd guess, that the most rapid job creation is happening at general merchandise stores like Walmart and Costco. Right behind them, monetary authorities, central banks, quote unquote. But as for most of the companies that actually benefited from the bailout by the Fed, they are not doing business right now. They have no path to profits, as far as we can tell. And as Dave said, there's no prospect for a recovery of the economy, which is a V-shaped recovery. So this bailout, it turns out, was a paper bailout. It looks good to the companies right now, but it's not a bailout of the real economy. A bailout of the real economy is going to take a bottom-up type of bailout, and that can only happen through fiscal policy, not at all through monetary policy. Now, I spent a lot of time on that. I'm going to try to go through the rest of this, the unemployment part of this, far more rapidly. But that article by Dave, I think, was just a little too priceless for me. I had to go through the whole thing. It was so important. So let me share the screen now on the unemployment part of this. So, this article in Common Dreams was written by Jake Johnson, and the headline is Grotesque. While 41 million people lost jobs due to COVID-19, billionaires in the U.S. grew nearly $500 billion richer. And this is from March 18th to May 28th, 10 weeks of the pandemic. Unemployed rose to 40.7 million people. Okay, and the date of this article was the 28th of May. So the unemployment news was out already. It was released on Thursday. So the U3 unemployment statistic by then went up to 40.7 billion. And the billionaire wealth increase was 485 billion, a 16.5% increase in 2 months, roughly. That brings the total wealth of our billionaires to $3.4 trillion. That is not at all surprising. In other words, the bailout that was given to the corporations that we just went through drove up the share prices of the corporations. And who is it? Who is it that owns stock in those corporations? In many cases, it's the billionaires. How much did the share stock of Oracle go up? For example, when they made, that enormous loan. In other words, they made an enormous bond issue, increasing the debt, of that particular company by, what was it? I forget, $20 billion or something like that. That probably drove Oracle shares up about through the roof. Who benefits from that? Well, it would be Larry Ellison. He's has a huge amount, of Oracle shares. I don't know if he's a majority owner anymore, but he owns a huge portion, and he's worth something like $40 to $50 billion or something like that. He was one of those that gained greatly from this. The Institute for Policy Studies, which has been publishing weekly updates on billionaire pandemic profiteering, found that their wealth grew by $485 billion, as that chart showed. So there we are. And Jeff Bezos and Zuckerberg saw their combined wealth rise by $63 billion over the last 10 weeks or so. And meanwhile, as reported by Common Dreams, a $2 an hour hazard pay increase for Amazon warehouse workers is set to expire at the end of the day on Sunday. That's tomorrow. The Institute for Policy Studies found there are currently 16 more billionaires than there were in mid-March, when many U.S. states began locking down their economies as COVID-19 spread very rapidly across the country. This isn't just unsustainable, Institute for Policy Studies tweeted of the surge in billionaire wealth. It's unconscionable. It is unconscionable. So let's move to the next article then. And the headline on this one, which was written by Owen Higgins on May 28th, is, would the progressives say people know who the real looters are? Not those angry over police killings, but oligarchs robbing the nation blind. Robbing the nation blind. So let's quickly go through this one. So as protests in Minneapolis and other U.S. cities over the police killing of George Floyd turned violent overnight, and as these protests have spread all over the country by now, right? Resulting in damage to some storefronts and buildings, complaints about looting sparked backlash from some of the progressives who pointed to the billions in wealth that were accumulated by corporations and the super rich in the past 3 months alone as the country grapples with the coronavirus pandemic. Benjamin Dixon said, okay, that Americans know who the real looters are. It's the billionaires who plundered America for $434 billion during the pandemic, while the essential workers keeping our country afloat make barely over minimum wage. I don't know if Ben has that figure right. I think it's 454 billion, but that went to the Federal Reserve to serve as backing for the Federal Reserve to issue all that debt, all those loans they were going to issue to the large corporations. And you just heard how it wasn't necessary to issue those loans, but just to threaten to issue those loans, which would have come with certain conditions for the companies. Now, the companies didn't really want to take those loans, but the very fact that the Fed was backing them up actually meant that it was possible for the big companies to sell corporate debt to their heart's content at much lower interest rates than they otherwise would have, because the Fed stood ready to back them with what would have been $4.54 trillion in Federal Reserve loans. And Warren Gunnels, who's Bernie Sanders' man with the receipts, tweeted, looting is 25 billionaires increasing their wealth by 255 billion in 2 months, while up to 580 million people throughout the world are pushed into poverty during this horrific pandemic. That's looting. And then the article describes the riots that exploded on the streets of Minneapolis on Wednesday. But of course, we all have been watching that, and we know about it. And progressives pointed to the disconnect between condemnation of those acts and the lack of a critical reaction to the country's richest people and corporations gaining billions in wealth since the beginning of the coronavirus. According to a recent Institute of Policy Studies report, U.S. billionaires have added $434 billion in wealth since the onset of the outbreak. Absolutely terrible to hear about all the looting happening right now. Kate Aronoff tweeted on Wednesday night, linking to a report of the billionaires' increase in wealth, and said, quote, someone should intervene, unquote. And progressive activist Peter Dow chimed in, sarcastically invoking calls for no more looting to make a broader point about who is benefiting from the pandemic and putting Wednesday's events in context. I heard there was looting, and I'm furious, said Peter Dow. Quote, are Republicans and Democrats stealing from the poor to bail out the rich in a pandemic? That kind of theft is unacceptable. Other progressives on social media also made a distinction between demonstrators angry at decades of brutality by the police and the billionaire class in the middle of obscene levels of wealth. In the middle of the billionaire class adding obscene levels of wealth in the pandemic. They didn't even have to work for it. All they had to do was get the Fed to create a $4.54 trillion slush fund, and then there didn't have to be any loans from that particular slush fund for the companies to bail themselves out, which they proceeded to do by selling the corporate bonds. That money was unearned money. It was totally unearned. But if Congress doesn't do something for the real economy and the real people who prop up the real economy, it won't be too many more months before the stock values of these companies go into the tank once again. Because this is blowing a bubble. They blew a debt bubble to blow a stock bubble. And if there's no purchasing power in the economy, that stock bubble is going to crash. That stock market, propped up, which is propped up by the debt bubble, which corporate America just blew, that is going to cause a crash. When? Maybe in the next 3 to 4 months. I don't see that people are going to consume at a high rate. I mean, they still don't have jobs. And they don't have a guaranteed income. And there's no job guarantee. And the retail businesses are going kaput. Dixon told Common Dreams, Ben Dixon this is, that the people are wise to the real looting in America and that the movement is only just beginning. Quote, the ruling elite have used our own civility to control us while robbing America blind, unquote, said Ben Dixon. And quote again, but we're hip to their game, unquote. I dare say we are hip to their game. So let's turn to the next one. So this one focuses on the unemployment picture itself. And this is from The Guardian. And the title of it is U.S. job losses pass 40 million as coronavirus crisis sees claims rise $2.1 million in a week. So those were the results on Thursday, the announcement, on Thursday. This is a picture of Joseph Lewis joining others in a protest asking the state of Florida to fix its unemployment system on the 22nd of May in the Miami Beach area. He's been laid off for 10 weeks. He's not getting any unemployment dollars for those weeks. He was supposed to get an extra $600 a week. I don't know what Florida pays, but let's say it pays $350 a week in normal times. He would have been getting $950 a week. He had 10 weeks, of unemployment. He didn't get a cent. He's out $9,000. This article was written by Lauren Aratani, because the unemployment system in Florida doesn't work. He ought to be able to sue the state for those $9,000. 28th of May, 2020, number of Americans who lost their jobs in the past 10 weeks soared to more than 40 million as the number of unemployment claims continued to rise, with 2.1 million people filing for unemployment last week. Remember, we kept talking about that extra 12.2 million people who were unemployed but not counted because they left the labor force. We're over 50 million unemployed right now, real unemployed. Staggering job losses mark a grim milestone in the economic crisis that has gripped the United States since the coronavirus triggered widespread shutdowns and stay-at-home orders in an effort to halt the spread of the deadly pandemic. The latest figures are down from the peak The peak was in early April. If you remember, 6.6 million Americans filed for unemployment, okay, in a single week. But to put this in context, the 2.1 million who just filed are far more than ever filed in 1 week in the recession of 2008, 2009, 2010, okay, and so on. I think the peak of that was at maybe 500,000 in 1 week or 300,000, okay, in 1 week. This still dwarfs, even the 2.1 million dwarfs what happened in that very big recession we had 10 years ago. Earlier this month, okay, the department, that is Labor Department, reported more than 20 million Americans lost their jobs in April, bringing the unemployment rate to 14.7%, up from 4.4%, okay, in March. So, of course, it's nearly the end of May. It will be the end of May on Sunday. So probably the monthly report will be out, probably in a week or two. And when it is, we'll undoubtedly find that the unemployment rate has gone into the 20s somewhere. While the growth of unemployment claims has slowed, millions more have continued to file for unemployment each week, bringing the total number of unemployed to a disastrous rate not seen since the Great Depression. That's true. The maximum for the Great Depression, as you know, was 24.9%. So we have to see if we're going to top that. The Department of Labor showed earlier this month that the leisure and hospitality industry was the hardest hit. $4.8 million in jobs lost in that industry. Nearly a 40% rate, okay, of unemployment as traveling came to a halt with shutdown measures. Okay, also millions of education, health services, retail, and manufacturing jobs were also cut. Even months after shutdown orders were put in place, the reported unemployment figures may not show a complete picture of how many people were laid off due to the crisis. Oregon, for example, announced this week that it is still trying to process 38,000 unemployment claims. And that's because there are many states still trying to work through their backlogs of thousands of applications because their online systems do not work. Those computer systems are very old, and many of them still are using COBOL programming to keep them going. That, for example, is what was going on in New Jersey. The state government there put out a call for COBOL programmers. Only old guys do COBOL programming these days. Only really old guys. I know a few guys who still do COBOL programming. They're needed to maintain those unemployment systems. They're so ancient. At the end of April, only a third of claims in Hawaii, a state that relies heavily on its tourism industry, had been processed. After Jazz Som was laid off from her job as a server at Chili's, she immediately got onto Florida's unemployment system to file her claim. It took her about a week to get through the system since the website kept crashing. When she was finally able to submit her claim, it took another month until she started receiving payments. During that month, Som, who lives in Sarasota, had no idea what the status of her application was. Having just used her savings to move in February, she was left without money to pay her bills or even buy groceries until payments came in. She said, "I think the government just needs to realize we just want to be heard. It all comes down to acknowledgement that us little people, what are we supposed to do? We're stuck," unquote. Yes, Nancy Pelosi, they're stuck. while you rummage around in your freezer full of designer ice cream and rare chocolates. Over the last few weeks, all 50 states have begun some type of reopening measures, bringing hope that the economy will revive as people start going back to work. But it is unclear what effect the measures have had on employment. The majority of the 20 million Americans, about 78%, who filed for unemployment in April, indicated they were temporarily laid off, meaning they expected to be called back to their jobs after the pandemic. But many businesses that have reopened are operating with far from normal procedures, like social distancing in dine-in restaurants and movie theaters. That means foot traffic is still down compared with pre-shutdown times. Many local businesses have had to shutter permanently, probably leaving tens of thousands of Americans unemployed indefinitely. Try tens of millions of Americans. Tens of millions of Americans. So that is Lauren Aratani's piece. So let me share the next horror story. Lots of horror stories tonight. This is from The Guardian also. Jobless America, the coronavirus unemployment crisis in figures. This one was written by Lauren Aratani again. Oh, gee. Let's see if I can still get this. If I can refresh. Oh, good. I refreshed it and got it. More than 40 million Americans have filed for unemployment over the last 10 weeks, a number of jobless we've not seen since the Great Depression. The economic impacts of COVID-19 have been far and wide, hurting virtually every industry, leaving tens of millions of people without paychecks to pay the bills. Then she goes over the key numbers that tell the story. The national unemployment rate, 14.7%. The Black and Hispanic unemployment rates, 16.7% and 18.9%. Percentage of unemployed Americans who are women, 55%. Though women make up a smaller percentage of the working population, a slight majority of people who were laid off in the last few months are women. At the beginning of May, Department of Labor reported nearly 11.5 million women had lost jobs, compared with about 11 million men. This is no coincidence, given that the industries that have been hardest hit by shutdown orders, hospitality and leisure, education and healthcare, employ more women than others. The leisure and hospitality unemployment rate is 39.8%. The state with the highest unemployment rate, guess what? It's Nevada, Las Vegas, and other places. In Nevada, their unemployment rate is 28.2%, meaning 1 in 4 people in the state of 3 million was unemployed, in April. Their economy relies heavily on tourism. And in Michigan, Hawaii had the second and third highest rates, 22.7% in Michigan, 22.3% in Hawaii. Also, Michigan has been suffering disproportionately from COVID-19, considering, its population. It has one of the highest fatalities per million rates in the country. The average unemployment insurance benefit is about $980, but pre-pandemic, the average unemployment insurance check was about $380. But because each state is in charge of its own unemployment system and sets the amount that is given in unemployment insurance, it varies widely. Some states give about a fifth of a person's paycheck, while others give half or more. To compensate for the widespread differences, those who successfully file for unemployment are given an extra $600 a week through the end of July, with money Congress set aside in its massive coronavirus stimulus package in March. While this means some are still barely making ends meet, others are getting more than they were getting in the jobs they were laid off from. The highest number of unemployed claims in 1 week, 6.6 million. That was the week between the 29th of March and the 4th of April. The number of households that were deemed food insecure, 1 in 5 households. Food banks have seen shortages in light of increased demand as millions of Americans struggle to pay for groceries. The analysis found the situation is worse for families with children. 2 in 5 households with mothers and children under the age of 12 are food insecure. And the number of gig workers who are unemployed is more than 6.1 million. In the latest stimulus package, Congress included a federal program that allows self-employed workers and contractors to receive unemployment benefits. In its report last week, the Department of Labor said that 6.1 million Americans who classify as self-employed were receiving unemployment insurance. Number 10, the percentage of low-wage workers unemployed was 40%. In remarks given on the 13th of May, the Federal Reserve Chair, Jay Powell, gave a shocking statistic from a Fed survey. 40% of households making under $40,000 a year lost the job in March. This reversal of economic fortune has caused a level of pain that is hard to capture in words, said Jay Powell. So while he was bailing out all the rich people, at least Jay Powell had some awareness and some feeling for what some of the poor people were actually going through. So now we get to one of the most important pieces of the day. Here it is. This is a policy note from the Levy Institute at Bard College. The note is by Pavlina Cherneva, and the title of it is Guaranteeing Employment During the Pandemic and Beyond. And it was written in April of 2020. And Pav says, economic vandalism, quote unquote, is how the late Bill Victory from 2004 described unemployment. Everything about the coronavirus response in the United States today suggests one thing tomorrow: guaranteed and prolonged mass unemployment, the kind that most of us have never witnessed. When the CARES Act loan guarantees, with already extremely weak job protections, expire, and firms face continued reduction in demand, the layoffs that did not take place during the pandemic, there are 40 million that have already taken place during the pandemic, will happen when the economy reopens. Whatever cash assistance we provide to families to keep them afloat now, millions of them will be scrambling for the pitifully scarce jobs of the post-pandemic world. And we know what many of those jobs will be: poorly paid, with no benefits or basic employment protections, much like the ones essential workers, quote unquote, currently have. That is to say, the delivery drivers, the grocery store clerks, and sanitation staff. while lending and cash assistance help firms and families pay the bills. They're not job creation policies. They are not even reliable job protection policies. Pavlina, of course, is associate professor of economics and director of the economics program at Bard College, and she's a research associate of the Levy Institute at the same time. She's also the chair of the economics department, okay, at Levy, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, let's go back to the beginning. And she asks, what conversations will fill the halls of economic conferences, the Fed's research offices, the chambers of Congress, and our TV screens tomorrow? Will experts tell us that the unprecedented global shock had created a wave of unemployment that was just inevitable, and unfortunately unemployment has turned into a structural and impossible to tackle problem, that the natural rate of unemployment is now permanently higher, and the NAIRU is in the double digits? We have seen this script before, says Pavlina. The avalanche of job losses today and mass unemployment tomorrow of our own making, created by our seeming inability to conceive of policies that protect and create jobs on demand. And when she says on demand, she means on demand from the individuals looking for jobs. She says there is another option. Instead of capitulating to a world of guaranteed unemployment, we can demand policies that guarantee employment. During the pandemic, the government can protect jobs. By acting as a kind of employer of last resort, while in the post-pandemic world, it can create jobs directly via mass mobilization and a job guarantee. In this environment, an employer of last resort backstopping payrolls and mobilizing masses and the job guarantee are three different but organically linked policies. As our European counterparts have done, the government can promise to pay the wages of workers whose jobs are threatened by COVID-19. This can be done in multiple ways. Some Scandinavian countries, the government participates in tripartite talks with firms and unions working to minimize the number of layoffs and offering to pay the wages, effectively becoming an employer of last resort of those workers whose jobs would have been eliminated. One more method would be for the government to provide direct grants to firms, as several members of Congress have recently proposed, that would cover the wages of all workers earning up to a certain amount, or furloughed and laid off workers only, with additional subsidies for operating costs. Each grant comes with explicit conditions to retain or bring back the laid off workers and use the funds as planned without any buybacks of stock or dividend payouts, CEO compensation, subsidies, or golden parachutes. The funding is not the issue. The $2.2 trillion authorized in the CARES Act was enough to pay every single wage in the U.S. economy for 3 months. If any of the above methods were attempted and the government paid a proportion of all wages, the budget could have protected jobs through the end of the year and possibly longer. Since more spending is on the way, it is not too late to pursue this strategy, says Pav. And she goes on. This is a short article, so it won't really take that long. It's a short note. It's a note. It's not really a paper. The government is essentially bankrolling private firms already and has the prerogative, nay, responsibility to impose other stipulations. For example, to require firms to offer hazard pay, guaranteed paid leave, and a minimum wage of $15 an hour for all workers. This would have the effect of fortifying working conditions through large swaths of the labor market in the United States, where nearly half of all workers earn below $10.22 an hour. This policy would still not be sufficient to combat unemployment or poorly paid employment, but it would rapidly stem the hemorrhage. The U.S. economy already lost 30 million jobs in just 6 weeks, which is greater by about 7.5 million than all the jobs created in the previous 11 years of recovery following the global financial crisis. Of course, it is now, as we know, 40.7 million jobs, not 30 million jobs. How many million more jobs will we lose next month? She asked. And the answer we know now, another 10.7 million. The Federal Reserve expects unemployment to exceed its levels in the Great Depression. Now's the time to plan a program that tackles the second epidemic, the social catastrophe that comes with mass unemployment. If we wait for the private sector to create the needed jobs, we shall be waiting too long. Jobless recoveries have become the norm for half a century now. And even when we managed to reach the lows of 3.5 unemployment in the months before the pandemic, economists were begrudgingly admitting that there was more labor market slack that was left. To restore jobs and good jobs too, the government must play a direct role in hiring the unemployed. And to do this on short order, it would need to launch large-scale public investment projects that create millions of good union and other well-paying jobs at all wage and skill levels. There are other existential threats before us, and there is plenty of work to do. The Green New Deal is the obvious place to start. It is important to make clear that large scale mobilization and direct job creation programs are not the same thing as ensuring that decent jobs are always available to anyone who is looking. The only way to do this is through a JG, and that is a job guarantee program, the third and indispensable piece of any comprehensive job creation and preservation strategy. It is a program that guarantees anyone who walks into the unemployment office can walk out with an employment option that offers a minimum living income with good benefits. The JG is a public option for jobs in the public service sector that offers on-the-job training and assistance with transitioning to other employment opportunities. And we're now coming to the last column on this, the answer to unemployment. Critically, the JG raises the wage floor by establishing a labor standard for minimum pay and working conditions for all jobs in the economy. It is a policy that ensures that precarious and poorly paid work is extinguished, along with the coronavirus, by increasing competition in the labor market, competition for workers. Why toil away at $7.25 an hour if the local Green JG project offers $15 an hour and Medicare? As an alternative to the most precarious private sector work, the JG pressures firms to improve their pay and benefits if they wish to retain and attract employees. Many private sector workers will get a pay raise, which in turn will boost spending, growth, and firm profits. Businesses that can only survive by paying poverty wages will no longer be viable, nor will those that use the threat of the sack to create the most difficult working conditions, wage theft and discrimination, harassment, but for the lowest wage and most vulnerable workers. The JG will give workers the power to say no, quote unquote, but to abusive employers. It will also act as a stepping stone for young people entering the labor market, an employment opportunity for caregivers who wish to return to paid work, and a bridge to civilian employment for former inmates and veterans. The bottom line is this: mass unemployment is avoidable, but having accepted it as an inevitable, even if unfortunate circumstance during recessions and pandemics, and worse, as a perennial feature of the economy, we have painted ourselves into a corner, unable to envision a world or policies that prevent it, and the pain it inflicts on families and communities. The JG is the assurance that good jobs will be waiting when the economy turns the lights back on. The stronger the job protection policies are now, the bigger and bolder the mobilization efforts tomorrow, the more nimble and effective the JG program can be. It remains the only policy that secures the essential, most basic economic right for all, the right to a decent, useful, and remunerative employment opportunity at all times, good or bad. One of the economic rights, I should add, that was to be guaranteed in the Economic Bill of Rights, okay, of by Franklin D. Roosevelt. And I call your attention also to a new book by Pavlina. Is that mentioned in here? It's called The Case for a Job Guarantee, and it's published by the Polity Press of Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I don't know if it's actually out yet. It doesn't say forthcoming, so it may be actually out. I need to check on it actually myself, because it's certainly a book, okay, that I'm going to buy. Okay, Pavlina is currently the leading writer on the job guarantee, in my estimation, in the country. And she, of course, is one of the leading MMT economists. Okay, so that's the answer to all of the unemployment we are seeing. So we have the bailout of the wealthy. That has happened, but it's a bubble that can burst, and the wealthy and the corporations don't seem to realize that, or don't seem to want to face it. If there's nobody around who wants to buy their products or their services, or has the means to buy their products or their services, the economy will crash. And even those companies that do have people around who had money at the start of a depression to buy their products and services will soon find that due to the general crash in the economy and the burgeoning level, okay, of unemployment, that but the money the people who can buy their products and services have will be disappearing as the whole economy goes very, very deeply into a depression. The reopening of the economy is not going to see a recovery that is V-shaped, because there has been no bailout of the bottom except for a temporary few months bailout, which is nearly over now. It is nearly over. The unemployment insurance bailout and the $1,200 stimulus fund bailout, that's nearly gone. There has to be a bailout that's going to sustain the economy for some time to come. The federal job guarantee is one kind of bailout. We could use that. We could use the basic income bill, okay, of Jay Powell, okay, and but also Rashida Tlaib, the bill that they suggested. I think, okay, it's more than a month ago now, okay, a month and a half ago. I think it was at the end of March, so it's 2 months old, but it's never made it into Nancy Pelosi's program. And that bill is essential. It's a basic income bill for as long as the crisis lasts, paying $2,000 a month to everyone and $1,000 for each child. And then for 1 year after, it will pay $1,000 to every person. I forget how much per child, whether it will pay $1,000 a child then or $500, and that's the rate for a whole year after the crisis ends, a whole year after the pandemic ends. That's going to backstop the real economy. If you couple it with a job guarantee, those two things will backstop the real economy and create enough money in it so that there will be a rebound of the economy, which will prevent a bursting of the bubble, which the rich have now blown by issuing so much debt to corporations. That debt will have to be redeemed someday by those corporations. They did not increase their net financial assets by borrowing that money, except, of course, to increase the paper value of their stocks. They did that, but there's no reason to believe that that's going to be a permanent increase. No reason at all to expect that that is going to be the case. So we and they have to keep that all in mind. Which I think brings me to the end for tonight. There were two other things I would like to have gone over, but I think I'm going to leave those for this evening. I'm just going to call your attention to them, and I'll treat them when we get back together on Monday night. Actually, there were three more things, okay, I wanted to go over. I just didn't think that going through Dave's article would take up so much time, but it was pretty essential because it really gave you the full picture of the bailout which has occurred, and it began to get into what it meant for people. I don't think Dave went as far as I went in pointing out how the bailout could backfire on the corporations and on the Fed as well, because the bailout is essentially a debt bubble for the corporations, and the increase in the value of their stock doesn't have to be a permanent increase, okay, at all. It's not a real increase in their net financial assets, because if there's no one to buy their product and services in 3 or 4 months from now, because there hasn't been a bailout of the bottom of the economy by Congress, then those businesses are in for a stock market crash. They're just, the way the political elite has played that, and the way the corporate elite has played things thus far, they are setting themselves up for another major crash. I'm not even talking about the reductions in stocks that we've thus far seen. The relatively small recent reductions in stocks are going to be nothing when the people who buy stocks realize that there's not going to be a sharp recovery in this economy, because the people at the bottom don't have the money to support such a recovery. There's another crash coming, in my view, folks. I think it's going to be more like 50% of current values. Anyway, there was an interesting debate which occurred in the Prospect again, actually. It goes over two options for crisis response before workers. So it deals once again, okay, with this problem of how are we going to handle the bottom of the economy? How are we going to handle a crisis response for workers that can save the uh, economy? And the two options are okay, they're debated by Jayapal on one side, and she is defending the paycheck guarantee program to get people away from the unemployment systems, which are not functioning very well. Okay, at this point. So she's then going to defend as the solution her paycheck guarantee program, ensuring workers will have a job to return to. But then Wesley Bignell and Marshall Steinbaum, who are very good economists, are going to argue that enhanced unemployment will bolster worker power and give low-wage employees considerable leverage over bad bosses and bad jobs. And so on Monday, I'm going to go into that particular debate, which I hope to cover tonight, but didn't have time to cover it. I also want to go over a short piece by John Kelly at the Common Dreams, which basically is about what Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said today. She said, if you want to end unrest, end the conditions that create it. And so I want to go over what she had to say, which in some ways, okay, is very good. And of course, it's true. Okay, it's also true, but it's really an old message. And that message has not worked before, but we have to make it work actually now. And then there was a third piece, and that was by also by John Kelly at Common Dreams. And he was covering Cornel West, what Cornel West had to say, okay, in an interview with Anderson Cooper, okay, at CNN. And the headline of that article, which I won't go through here today, is the neo-fascist gangster Trump and neoliberal Democrats exposed America as a failed social experiment, unquote. And that was a very notable statement by Cornel West, which we will also postpone until Monday to go through. Okay, now I will turn to your comments. I hope you'll stay with me when I consider those. I see a good many of you have, so thank you very much for that. And I see I have 45 comments to go through. Please share, like, and subscribe when my YouTube goes up. And also please share the Facebook video. And Steve says, Fiorella and Johnny Tsunami got arrested at the demonstration at Fairfax and 3rd. Steve says, hi, Kay. Steve Gonzo says, but no doubt, I'm glad Joe's on. I needed a break. Kay says, hi, Steve. Steve Gonzo says, cops are out of control. they started many of the escalations. The cops have been out of control for some time. They've been out of control for years and years. They've been out of control since the 1990s. They were out of control during the Occupy movement. And they've been out of control at World Bank protests. But they've been out of control whenever there has been widespread activism going on. Steve says Los Angeles goes under curfew tonight at 8 p.m. The cops will rampage. It could get ugly. Yes, they did, Steve. Joy Marie Mann gave a report in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and Kathy Cowan Becker from Ohio. Peaceful protests were met with police pepper spraying and mace, etc. The police are causing problems. Yeah, that's what Trump wants them to do, to cause problems. It's a violence approach to containing dissatisfaction, okay, and protest. Okay, says, not sure what happened in Cleveland, Ohio earlier, but 2 cop cars were set on fire there. SMH, DeWine ordered the National Guard to those cities now. Not good. Kent State University, 1970 comes to mind. I think it's going to be a lot worse than Kent State University. Steve said Bernie was a compromise. Okay, negotiations are now over. Hashtag FAFO. Enlighten me, Steve Gonzo. What does FAFO mean? Barbara Wernick says people are still not being heard. This police state BS is not going to end well. No, not in America that has so many guns. It's just going to result in more and more people getting those guns. The scenes I'm watching have the people being forced into compliance by militarized force. Dale says, yes, Barbara, it's insane. What is FAFO? Stephanie says, massively shared. Love you guys. Good night. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you for your efforts. Steve Gonzo says, fuck around, find out. Thank you, Steve. Kay says, everything for big corps and banks and zero for we the people, SMH. Corporations are using their stimulus for TV commercials. Kay says, tear gas in Minneapolis now after a peaceful protest all day until that happened just now. Makes me so mad. Steve says the entire crowd in hashtag Denver just laid face down on the Capitol lawn and chanted, I can't breathe, for 8 minutes and 47 seconds. And Barbara Wernick said MSNBC was just attacked with gas. Kay says people are sick of so many things in this country. People of all colors. Barbara in Minnesota. Barbara says, Havana Del, yes. Deborah says, share to my page early on. Kay says, police are chasing the MSNBC guys down the street in Minneapolis now. So a couple of nights ago, they were starting on CNN, and so MSNBC, not to be outdone, has now got the police chasing them. And Steve says, cops are now taping over their body cameras. Steve Gonzo said that. And Lana says, Kay, what the fuck? Kay says, cops starting shit again, Lana. Kay says, I'm in and out again tonight. Cops are starting shit everywhere when there was peace before, damn. And Deborah Wilson says, not only unsustainable, but unconscionable. Steve says, looks like a military green light in Columbia, South Carolina. Ali Velshi got hit by a rubber bullet to his leg. All these corporate Dems need to go now, SMH. What? Great Christmas, says Troy Astro. Kay says, trouble in Miami, Florida, now started by cops. Why would law enforcement be targeting the media? Because law enforcement doesn't want the media to be able to report on what law enforcement does during these demonstrations. What they want to do is be free to kill people and not have it on video, Lana. Steve says, the umbrella man was a cop. Kay says, they target everybody, Lana. It's ridiculous. And Lana says, no, Florida's as cheap as $275 a week. She's talking about the unemployment people get in Florida. Kay says, very hard for people to get even that too, Lana. And Troy says, what in Sam Hill is wrong with you? This is like 10-watt 65s and Detroit 67s rolled in one. There's nothing wrong with us. There's something wrong with this system, Troy. And the sooner you realize it, the better off you two will be. There's nothing in Sam Hill wrong with us. It's like 10 watts and Detroit 67s rolled into one because people are angry about what's been happening with COVID-19. They're angry about the unemployment. They're angry at the bailout of the rich. Remember the formation of the Tea Party in 2009? That was in reaction to the bailout of the rich. This is another massive bailout for the rich, at least for the short term. They're just getting bailed out by the Federal Reserve. You just heard it here tonight. Okay, I covered that. And then there's the deaths from COVID-19. And then there's also the unemployment as an indirect effect of COVID-19. Okay, and then there's the fact that people have gotten almost nothing during this time to support them. Everything for the corporations and nothing for the people. And then on top of it, there's cops killing people because they're the wrong color, whatever the hell they feel like, and never getting put in jail for it. Steve Gonzo says, they're about to try to enforce a curfew in Dayton that few even knew about. Kay says, Columbus and Cincinnati, Ohio, too. Steve says, there are many more not even on this map. Sandy says, but Philadelphia is going nuts. Look, it's obvious. If people can't exercise their First Amendment rights of freedom of assembly, peaceful freedom of assembly, what's going to happen is they're going to start showing up with guns too, just like the right is doing, just like the rednecks are doing. The rest of us are going to show up with guns to protest also, because we see what happens when the right goes out to protest and they bring guns. Then the cops don't do anything. Then they don't do anything. What they do is they go after the peaceful protesters. Steve says, I don't think Columbus and Cincy will work. But they just said Dayton is now secure. 15 arrests, 2 felonies, 1/3 out of state. And Jonathan Rodriguez says, hello, what's the topic? Jonathan says, 2,000 are bust. The unemployment crisis and the real looters. Can MMT be used to fix income inequality like we give everyone 10,000? Okay, Jonathan. So you have to realize what MMT is it's an approach to economics. It's a lens for looking at the economy. Now, we can devise policies based on our knowledge about this kind, of lens. I think that's the kind of thing you're talking about here. Now, we can give everyone $10,000, yes, but we would not give them $10,000 just like that, because if we gave $10,000 to everybody in the economy all at once, at one point in time, the inflationary effects could be substantial. On the other hand, if we gave everybody a basic income of $2,000 a month, for the duration of the crisis, that would be feasible. And if we continued with 1,000 a month for a year thereafter, that would also be feasible. If we created a job guarantee program for people, which paid a living wage, cost adjusted across the country, we could also afford to do that. Now, these things involve spending trillions of dollars. We can afford to spend trillions of dollars, but we have to design the programs carefully so that they do not give rise to inflation, that they create full employment, also a type of full employment that is tight, full employment that makes the labor market a good one. But at the same time, one of the goals of MMT is price stability as well as full employment. And yes, we can use MMT-based knowledge or policies to achieve these goals. Sandy Degg says yes, and Sandy Degg says, but will they do it? And Jonathan Rodriguez says, 1.5 billion for corporations, trillion, 0.5 billion for average Americans. What are the odds? Not billion, trillion, Jonathan, trillion. Sandy says, I think the government enjoys watching the people starve and lose everything they own. I don't think the government enjoys that. I think the people who are currently running the government appear to enjoy that. They are people who should never have been in government. What does it mean when the government gives money to corporations, subsidies? That's a form of lemon socialism. That's what it means. Deborah says, the Koch brothers mantra, survival of the fittest, of the poor can die. Kay says, with all that is going on now, the ones that are dead are at least out of it all and finally at peace. Jonathan says, gotta go right now, and if I don't go to go right, right now. Jonathan says, job guarantee. Kay says, LA is a mess now too. But Tammy Oliphant says, not even a few months worth, barely one. Jonathan says, let's call neoliberals lemonheads. Sandy says, Nancy needs a good kick in the past. She needs a kick in the pants sufficient to kick her right out of the Congress. She needs to resign. We've had her for too long. She is way past her sell-by date. Nancy and many others like her need to be gone. Dolores Pierce. And Jonathan Rodriguez says, slow recovery. There's not going to be, there might not be a recovery at all, Jonathan. Not with what's going on now. Not unless there's a bailout for the bottom. Jonathan says, some people say this virus has been a blessing because it's making people more woke to the way the system works. Something that kills 100,000 people may have some salutary side effects. Oh, by the way, as of today, the fatalities in the United States were up to 105,000 now. Something that kills 105,000, which was largely avoidable. Largely avoidable. How do I know, Jonathan? Because Taiwan, which has 24 million people, a sizable population, has only had 7 fatalities. Only 7 fatalities. If we had policies for handling the virus that were the same as Taiwan's policies, we would have had something like 110 fatalities. Instead, we have 105,000 some odd fatalities, right? Okay, at this moment. 105,557 is our total right now, according to the COVID-19 stats.live tracker. That is not a blessing. We may get some good things out of it, but having that happen in just a little more than 2 months is not a blessing. Sandy says, we need more unions. Yes, we do, Sandy. Sandy says we're being pushed to our limits. Kay says, I'm now kind of sorry I gave all our guns away when I lost the house after my hubby died a few years ago. I might need one now. Yeah, we all might need one now. Okay. I am through your comments at this point. So I'm about to say good night. I hope you'll be back on Monday. As you know, I'll have a lot of good things to talk about. Okay, at that point, I've got so many good things to talk about. They're kind of overflowing me right now. Anyway, good night. Thank you for coming. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for being here. I'm sure I'll be talking about the further spread of the protests on Monday, as well as the pieces I've told you that I will talk about. Dolores says, thank you and good night. And thank you, Dolores, for all your help tonight. And Kay says, night all. And again, I'm going to say good night.